Well, good evening and welcome. Thank you for coming. We've been listening to Beethoven's Große Fuge, and the reason for that is because Sylvia Plath was very struck by the music, and she actually wrote a little fugue, which is to some degree a reflection on Beethoven's amazing fugue. And I think we can speculate that it's a piece of music that seems to appeal to every aspect of human emotion, which would naturally be something that she would be struck by. So there are some interesting difficulties about reading Plath's poetry and making sense of it. First and foremost, the question of biography, which is always there, luring us to read the poems as nothing more than an experience she's had, put on paper and perhaps made unnecessarily difficult. So biography is always there in the background, and of course the biography is one of mental illness, of attempted suicide, of loves, of marriage, and of eventual successful suicide. But more than that, there's the presence of her husband, the poet Ted Hughes, and that presence continues for a good many years after her death. And he, of course, was very heavily involved in editorial work and interpretative work of her poetry. Now, what I want to argue this evening is that too much attention, in my view, has been paid to the nature of the influence of these two poets, one upon the other. It's not surprising, given that for the 6 years that they cohabited, Plath produced the vast majority of her poetry, and the poetry that's generally considered to be her best poetry, and Hughes was also very productive during those years. Now, I want to begin by considering how they both felt about this idea of a sort of codependency, one on the other. And then I want to go on to see what literary historians and critics, and indeed biographers, have had to say about this relationship of two poets. And then moving away from the idea of their partnership and ideas of sort of codependency, I'd like to explore the influence of the so-called confessional movement of poetry in America in the 1950s and 60s. And then I'll finish up arguing against Ted's reading of one of Plath's poems, one of her very last poems, Sheep in Fog. So let's begin with the question of influence. Literary partnerships aren't actually that rare. Here are a few. Rebecca West, who was married to H.G. Wells, Catherine Mansfield with John Middleton Murray, Jean Rice and Ford Mallet Ford, Simone de Beauvoir and Jean-Paul Sartre, Martha Gellhorn and Ernest Hemingway, Plath and Hughes, and I'm sure there are lots more that I haven't thought of. And in each of these relationships, there was both sexual and literary passion, and a kind of obsessive, maybe even desperate dimension, which is perhaps part of what we think of in terms of codependency. I'm using this term very loosely. Well, in 1958, 2 years after Plath and Hughes had met, Plath wrote in her journal, "I must be happy first in my own work and struggle to that end, so my life does not hang on Ted's. Do we, vampire-like, feed on each other? A wall, a soundproof wall, must mount between us. Strangers in our study, lovers in bed." So this is Plath obviously expressing a degree of anxiety about the creative side of their relationship. And this is, you can see the typewriter, so this is Plath and Hughes in their study. And it certainly doesn't look to me as though there's a sort of metaphorical war between them, but rather a great deal of exchange going on. And then a couple of years later, in that same year of 58, she wrote, "We are amazingly compatible, but I must be myself, make myself, and not let myself be made by him." And here, presumably, she's showing him one of her poems. Now, a couple of years after that, in 1961, Ted and Hughes gave a rather remarkable interview to the BBC Third Programme, as it was then known. And naturally enough, they were asked about their relationship, and in particular, what it was like for two creative writers to be physically so close. The broadcast was called Two of a Kind, Poets in Partnership. And one of the things that they were inevitably asked was about the influence on each other's poetry. And Plath, who was generally extremely articulate and eloquent, is rather confused in her answer. And I think this too testifies to a real anxiety about the question of their influence on each other. So here are the opening minutes of that interview from 1961.
Where do you come from, Ted?
Originally from Mytham Royd in West Yorkshire, near Halifax.
And what about you, Sylvia?
Oh, I was born in Boston, Massachusetts, but I think I'm over here in England to stay now.
Well, somehow or another there's a meeting between Yorkshire and the United States. Would you like to tell us how it happened?
Well, I left Cambridge in 1954, but I still had friends there that I used to go back and see now and again. And one of these friends produced a poetry magazine. This magazine just saw one issue. Anyway, I had some poems in this, and we had a celebration the day it came out.
To which I came. I happened to be at Cambridge. I was sent there by the government on a government grant, and I'd read some of Ted's poems in this magazine. I was very impressed, and I wanted to meet him. And I went to this little celebration, and that's actually where we met.
How did you develop this first meeting?
Well, I think we saw each other again on a Friday the 13th or something, in London, didn't we, somehow, after this? And then we saw a great deal of each other. Ted came back to Cambridge, and suddenly we found ourselves getting married a few months later.
I'd saved some cash. I'd been working for about 3 months, and everything I'd saved, I blew it in on a courtship, which lasted about 3 months.
What was the actual form of this proposal?
We kept writing poems to each other, and then it just grew out of that, I guess, a feeling that we both were writing so much and having such a fine time doing it. We decided that this should keep on.
The poems haven't really survived. The marriage overtook the poems.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, in none of these books of poetry is there anything, apart from the dedications to Ted, to Sylvia, which really I could interpret as being to each other or even about each other.
Well, I think that all the poems that we wrote to each other and about each other were really before our marriage, and then something happened. I don't know what it was. I hope it was all to the good, but we began to be able to, well, somehow free ourselves for other subjects. And I think the dedications, at least as far as mine goes, I feel that I'd never be writing as I am and as much as I am without Ted's understanding and cooperation, really.
So here, Plath suggests that the poems that they wrote to each other before their marriage were somehow inferior to what came later, presumably after they, and I quote, freed themselves and therefore their poems from each other's influence. Well, I want to come back to the whole notion of influence in a moment, but just to say a little more about her choice of words there. She claims to be unclear as to how they found this freedom. She says something happened, I don't know what, and unsure about whether it was really for the best. I hope it was all to the good. But then she goes on to pay homage to Hughes' understanding and cooperation, not to his help or inspiration, but understanding and cooperation. And this seems to contradict her claim that marriage brought a new freedom. And as the interview continues, they both contradict one another in different sorts of ways. But Hughes expresses very little anxiety about this idea of influence. He talks about the fact that they share, and I quote, a single shared mind, a telepathic union, and that it's a source of a great deal, unquote, in his poetry. On the other hand, he emphasizes that when they happen to write about the same subject, they always approach it very differently. Plath says Hughes encouraged her to bring the natural world into her writing, but as you'll hear in an interview that we'll hear in a moment, she talks about nature having been her earliest inspiration. And she's ill at ease with the interviewer's claims that she and Hughes write about nature in similar ways. Her retort is, "This was true of our poems before we ever knew each other, but now their work is," she says, "really different, quite different." Now, I don't think it's surprising that in an interview of this sort, two poets would express this sort of anxiety. And the same anxiety is actually visible in some of their poetry. Most obviously, I think, in Hughes's poem Love Song from his collection Crow, which was published in 1970, 7 years after Plath's suicide. And here are the lines in question. "In their entwined sleep, they exchanged arms and legs. In their dreams, their brains took each other hostage. In the morning, they wore each other's face." Now, to some degree, these lines, if not the lines that precede them, are a simple parody of love poetry. But then the shock comes in the penultimate and final lines. The transferred epithet entwined belongs in conventional prose to the arms and legs. We talk about arms and legs being entwined, not sleep. The arms and legs are not entwined, they are exchanged. And this is the first hint of perhaps something more sinister. Limbs can only be exchanged if severed. And in the penultimate line, brains take each other hostage. Hostage-taking is a violent business. So the conventional entwined sleeping lovers become less conventional with the suggestion that their subconscious minds, which after all work away when we're asleep and dreaming, are at war. And the final line suggests an exchange of identity, as though the self has been so lost in the other as to become the other, wearing each other's faces. This final line suggests an exchange of identity, the self lost so close to the other as to become the other. So Plath's idea that they must be, and I quote, "strangers in their study, lovers in bed," that I quoted earlier, finds echo in Hughes's poem, written years later and after Plath's death. But I'm not suggesting that Hughes' poem should be read in a narrow biographical way, any more than Plath's poetry. The poem is about psychosexual complexity, which is something that we've all experienced, and ideas of dominance and submission and independence and dependency are germane to all human relationships, whether it's between a parent and a child or siblings. It can never be absolutely equal in terms of power. But if you're a poet, then there's this extra dimension involved, this question of influence. And Harold Bloom, great critic, studied this phenomenon in a book that I very much recommend, and it's entitled The Anxiety of Influence. And his central thesis is that poets have to overcome the poets of the past, that they draw on the poets of the past, but they have to find their own voice. So there will always be allusions to the poetic, the great poetic tradition, but the poet has to ensure that his work, the living poet's work, or her work, is not imitative or derivative or unoriginal. And unless the poet's vision is strong, their work will be forgotten. And what Bloom goes on to do is to try to establish why it is that a small minority of poets are sufficiently strong to survive, while the vast majority are forgotten. If you think of the number of poems that have been written and the number that we still know and still read, it's a tiny proportion. And so Bloom's question is, what is it about these poets that have enabled them to survive? So is the anxiety expressed by Plath and Hughes actually any different from the anxiety felt by all poets when it comes to the question of influence? Well, the biographies certainly complicate matters. And in her subtle study, The Silent Woman, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes of 1994, which is about the two poets, but is also a wonderful essay, long essay in effect, on the problems of biography and the ethics of biography, particularly when a relative of the subject of the biography is still alive. And of course, Ted's sister is still alive, and in fact talked to the press recently for the first time and that was because of reservations about the new Bate biography of Ted Hughes. But that brought her out of a silence. So, as Janet Malcolm writes in this wonderful book, The Silent Woman, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes, of 1994, she writes, "Life, as we all know, does not reliably offer, as art does, a second and a third and a 30th chance to tinker with a problem. But Ted Hughes's biography seems to be uncommonly bare of moments of mercy that allow one to undo or redo one's actions and thus feel that life isn't entirely tragic. Whatever Hughes might have done or redone in his relationship with Sylvia Plath, the opportunity was taken from him when she committed suicide in February 1963 by putting her head in a gas oven as her 2 small children slept in a bedroom nearby, which she had sealed against gas fumes and where she had placed mugs of milk and a plate of bread for them when they woke." They'd been married, that's the end of the quotation. They'd been married for 6 years and they'd separated. They were young. Hughes was with another woman. It's not such an extraordinary story, but as she goes on to write, "A person who dies at 30 in the middle of a messy separation remains forever fixed in the mess. To the readers of her poetry and her biography, Sylvia Plath will always be young and in a rage over Hughes' unfaithfulness. She will never reach the age when the tumults of young adulthood can be looked back upon with rueful sympathy and without anger and vengefulness." I think it's hardly surprising that we read the poetry via what we know of the biographies. And a number of critics have considered this question, the question of influence. Now, the first full-length study was by Margaret Uroff, who looked at the poetic influence between Plath and Hughes, and she argues, and I quote, that they should be read as parts of a continuing debate about the nature of the universe in which Plath's reservations and Hughes's assertions play against each other. And of course, you might say that that's quite a gendered way of looking at things. Plath's reservations and hesitancy and Hughes' assertions and more manliness, as it were. And she claims that Plath's, quote, interest in psychological states and extreme human experiences are similar to Hughes's, and I quote, concern with the non-human cosmos, end of quotation. She claimed that they influence each other in equal measure, albeit at different stages of their poetic development. Now, Uroff's study came out 2 years before the publication of Sylvia Plath Collected Poems, 1981, edited, of course, by Ted Hughes. And he made a number of editorial decisions that have been questioned. He rearranged the Ariel manuscript, that was the collection that Plath had published before she died. So he made a decision that the collected poems would be organized chronologically. And so the way Plath had organized the Ariel poems wasn't chronological. And there must have been a reason for that, because we all know that the way we read a poem is to some degree affected by the poem that precedes and the poem that follows. That gives it a kind of context. And so to arrange the poems chronologically disturbs that aspect of the poems, which was obviously a very conscious decision on Sylvia Plath's part. He also burnt her last journal, which for scholars of Plath is a great tragedy. And he labelled her pre-Cambridge and therefore pre-Hughes work juvenilia. And of course, if you come to a collection of poetry and there's a section called juvenilia, that immediately prepares you for less good poetry. And I think that becomes self-fulfilling in a sense. But more surprising, I think, are the notes in the collected poems. So not only did he work out their order, but he provides quite detailed notes, mostly about what they were doing at the time the poem was written. And an example would be Plath's poem, The Burnt Out Spar, that she wrote in 1959. And in the notes, we have Hughes telling us, and I quote, "The old health spa at Saratoga Springs remained only as a burnt-out spa." Now, if Plath had wanted to write about a specific spa, she could have named it as Saratoga Springs, the spa at Saratoga Springs. And what Plath's poem does is to conjure an idea, a mood about this burnt-out spar. It doesn't refer to a single real spar. And you could say that the idea alludes to other poetry, and that might be the kind of thing that an editor would provide in a note. And I'm thinking particularly of Burnt Norton. One of the wonderful things about the burnt-out spar is surely the idea of fire and water being brought into relationship, and the elements are particularly important in Eliot's four quartets, the first of which he entitles Burnt Norton. And a few lines before the end of Plath's poem, we have the line, "and we shall never enter there," which is surely reminiscent of these lines from Eliot's Burnt Norton, "down the passage we did not take, towards the door we never opened." Seems to me very similar to the idea that Plath's introducing in the line, "and we shall never enter there." Now, Hughes scholars tend to deny that Hughes was influenced in any way by Plath's poetry. Others have argued that there was something more like a dialogue. Susan Van Dyne writes, "Plath's dialogue with Hughes's poems is always competitive and her strategy revisionist." Well, with the publication of Hughes's birthday letters in 1998, just before he died, the whole debate about influence became even more lively. Diary entries and letters to friends reveal Hughes explaining how he'd first begun what he called a written conversation with Plath as far back as the 1970s. Birthday Letters was a bestseller, and it was mostly read, I think, because people thought that somewhere in these poems there would be an explanation of Plath's suicide. Again, they've been read extraordinarily biographically. Well, Diane Middlebrook was able to take Birthday Letters into consideration when she wrote her study, Her Husband, Hughes and Plath, A Marriage, of 2003, and she explores what she terms the call and response manner of their productive collusion. And more recently, Heather Clark has provided a thorough study of the borrowings and echoes and allusions between the two poets' work in a book called The Grief of Influence, Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. It's a very good book in many ways, and the result of extensive research, both of published and unpublished sources. But I'd like to query her reading of two poems which are quite often read alongside one another, Hughes's Hawk in the Rain and Plath's Black Rook in Rainy Weather. Now, Clark claims that Plath's Rook is a response to Hughes's Hawk, and she further claims that Plath's intention is to explore, and I quote, as Hughes does, the self's place in nature, employing, she says, feminine imagery to assert an essential harmony between humankind and nature. Now, I think this is Clark allowing her feminist sympathies to prejudice her reading, the idea that Plath's imagery is somehow a feminine imagery, and she's suggesting a sort of harmony, and that Hughes is doing something slightly different. So we'll now hear the two poems read. So the first one, Hughes's poem, read by Hughes, and then Plath's, read by Plath.
I drown in the drumming ploughland. I drag up heel after heel from the swallowing of the earth's mouth, from clay that clutches my each step to the ankle with the habit of the dogged grave. But the hawk effortlessly at height hangs his still eye. His wings hold all creation in a weightless quiet, steady as a hallucination in the streaming air. While banging wind kills these stubborn hedges, thumbs my eyes, throws my breath, tackles my heart, and rain hacks my head to the bone, the hawk hangs, the diamond point of will that pulls stars the sea drowner's endurance. And I, bloodily grabbed, dazed, last moment counting morsel in the earth's mouth, strain toward the master fulcrum of violence where the hawk hangs still, that maybe in his own time meets the weather coming the wrong way, suffers the air hurled upside down fall from his eye, the ponderous shires crash on him, the horizon trap him, the round angelic eye, smashed, mix his heart's blood with the mire of the land.
And then Plath.
Black rook in rainy weather. On the stiff twig up there hunches a wet black rook, arranging and rearranging its feathers in the rain. I do not expect a miracle or an accident to set the sight on fire in my eye. I seek no more in the desultory weather some design, but let spotted leaves fall as they fall without ceremony or portent. Although I admit I desire occasionally some back talk from the mute sky, I can't honestly complain. A certain minor light may still leap incandescent out of kitchen table or chair, as if a celestial burning took possession of the most obtuse objects now and then, thus hallowing an interval otherwise inconsequent by bestowing largesse, honor, one might say love. At any rate, I now walk wary, for it could happen even in this dull, ruinous landscape, skeptical yet politic, ignorant of whatever angel may choose to flare suddenly at my elbow. I only know that a rook, ordering its black feathers, can so shine as to seize my senses, haul my eyelids up, and grant a brief respite from fear of total neutrality. With luck trekking stubborn through this season of fatigue, I shall patch together a content of sorts. Miracles occur, if you care to call those spasmodic tricks of radiance miracles. The wait's begun again, the long wait for the angel, for that rare, random descent.
So both these poems meditate on the bird to some extent, the rook and the hawk, and in both there is rain. But Plath's desultory weather is in sharp contrast with Hughes's rain hacks my head to the bone. In Plath, there's an intellectual distance between the speaking subject and the object it describes, desultory meaning lacking purpose or enthusiasm. Hughes's speaking subject is caught up in a violent physical encounter, and this is typical of much of his poetry. The rain is an aggressor, hacking both the subject's head and bone. And I think we immediately recognize the truth of the poetic experience. Cold rain in a wind can feel like a brutal assault. Both poems could be said to originate from the experience of being out in the country, but the poems are strikingly different. Hughes's is a feat of human endurance in the face of murderous forces. Plath's poem is about the thoughts inspired by nature. Hughes is about a physical encounter between self and what is outside the self, the comparison of the poet who remains earthbound and the weightless bird surveying swathes of land from on high. It's quite a worn conceit. Baudelaire in the 19th century wrote a great poem about the albatross in which he compares himself to the albatross, and both poems culminate in the bird's death. Both the poet and the bird suffer the violence of the world. Hughes's poem is physical, Plath's is intellectual. The ponderous reflections in Plath's poem are communicated by means of parenthetical clauses, although I admit I desire. At any rate, I now walk. Plath's poem wants to establish a relationship between the walker and her surroundings. She talks about wanting some back talk from the mute sky. She wants to be able to communicate with nature. And the fear of total neutrality is surely the absence of poetic inspiration, the fear of total neutrality, the poet not actually feeling any kind of spark of inspiration from what's around her. It's all neutral. But, I quote, miracles occur. So for Hughes, on the other hand, nature is not a source of poetic inspiration, but a force that has to be resisted, has to be stood up to. In Plath's poems, the hostile forces are psychological, the fear of losing inspiration. In Hughes's poem, there are sound patternings that add very much to the atmosphere of violence. There are stressed syllables and frequent alliteration, which recall the rhymes of Anglo-Saxon verse. This all helps Hughes to take his reader back in time to a barbaric England that's dark and threatening and where there are warring factions. For much of Plath's poem, the speaker seems unaware of the rook. 9 of the clauses have I as their subject. I do not expect nor seek. I admit, I desire, I can't honestly complain, and so on. And the foreground is very much to foreground the speaker and the meditative state that the speaker's in. Most of the verbs are assertive. On the other hand, 5 of the remaining 10 clauses use modal verbs, may and might, and so on. One might say love. A certain minor light may still lean. Incandescent one might say, it could happen. Whatever angel may choose to flare a rock, another image of inspiration. This angel may choose to flare a rock, may make this rock become a subject of poetic inspiration. And there are also 2 conditional verbs introduced by if, as if a celestial burning took possession, if you care to call. And these conditionals also create an atmosphere of speculation. If this happens, that might happen. The verb forms given to the rook, by contrast, are straightforward present indicatives. It hunches, it arranges and rearranges, and then it orders its feathers, releasing as it does the shine, again, what provides the poetic inspiration. The poet becomes the object. We hear that the rook seizes her senses, hauls her eyelids up, and grants a brief moment of reassurance. Miracles occur. The effect of the poetic techniques combine to convey a sense of an experience that it is little more than a glimpse caught in the corner of the eye. It's fleeting, delicate, perhaps something that will disappear if subjected to too much scrutiny. And here it's Eliot who is the major influence. In my last lecture, we reflected on the, and I quote, other echoes that inhabit T.S. Eliot's garden in Burnt Norton, the unheard music, the unseen eye-beam, the empty pool. Hughes's poem is, as Clarke suggests, about the self in nature, but Plaths is not. Plaths is about a fleeting, psychic, and mysterious experience of poetic inspiration. It takes place in nature, but this is to a large degree incidental. It's about the experience of inspiration and the fear that that inspiration may stop happening. So reading these 2 poems alongside each other, I would say, doesn't demonstrate any particular interaction between the 2 poets' visions or poetic techniques. I think what it reveals is how strikingly different the 2 poems are. Now, Plath learnt how to write poetry by reading poetry, as all poets do, imitating other poets' styles and experimenting with different kinds of form, and immersing herself in her thesaurus to make sure she had as wide a possible vocabulary. She began writing very obviously under the influence of W.H. Auden, who was touring American college campuses in the 1950s, and she was also influenced by Wallace Stevens, Marion Moore, Robert Lowell, Anne Sexton, Theodore Rothke. Plath was writing very much within the American tradition, and Hughes was writing within an English tradition, or I should say English, Welsh and Irish tradition, Shakespeare, Wordsworth, Yeats, Lawrence, Dylan Thomas, Robert Graves, but always interested in the instinctive rather than the intellectual. Now, Plath suffered a breakdown when she was at Smith College in 1953. She attempted suicide, and when she was physically well enough, she was admitted to Maclean's mental hospital in Belmont. And here it is, rather fine building. Now, this is the same institution that the poet Robert Lowell had attended after his breakdown, and also the hospital where Anne Sexton was first encouraged to write poetry, and they are both, as many of you will know, major American poets. Now, Lowell's daring in introducing the taboo of mental illness into poetry was a very major influence on Plath. This was the so-called confessional movement of poetry in America in the 1950s and 60s. And here is Plath describing just how important Robert Lowell's poetry was for her.
Sylvia, what started you writing poetry?
I don't know what started me. I just wrote it from the time I was quite small. I guess I liked nursery rhymes, and I guess I thought I could sort of do the same thing. I wrote my first poem, my first published poem, when I was 8 and a half. It came out in the Boston Traveler. And from then on, I suppose I've been a bit of a professional.
What sort of things did you write about when you began writing poetry?
Nature, I think. Birds, bees, spring, fall, all those subjects which are absolute gifts to the person who doesn't have, sort of any interior experiences to write about. I think that the coming of spring, the stars overhead, first snowfall, and so on, are gifts for a child, a young poet.
Now, jumping the years, can you say, are there any themes which particularly attract you now as a poet, things that you feel you would like to write about?
Perhaps this is an American thing. I've been very excited by what I feel is the new breakthrough that came with, say, Robert Lowell's life studies, this intense breakthrough into very serious, very personal, emotional experience, which I feel has been partly taboo. Robert Lowell's poems about his experiences in a mental hospital, for example, interest me very much. These peculiar, private, and taboo subjects, I feel, have been explored in recent American poetry. I think particularly of the poetess Anne Sexton, who writes also about her experiences as a mother who's had a nervous breakdown, as an extremely emotional and feeling young woman. And her poems are wonderfully craftsmanlike poems, and yet they have a kind of emotional and psychological depth, which I think is something perhaps quite new, quite exciting.
So, in 1950s America, admission was a very brave thing to do. And it was hugely liberating for Plath, who had a very complex inner life. And one of the poems that she wrote, which I think very much shows this influence, is her poem, Miss Drake Proceeds to Supper. No novice in those elaborate rituals which allay malice of knotted table and crooked chair, the new woman in the ward wears purple, steps carefully among her secret combinations of eggshells and breakable hummingbirds, footing sallow as a mouse between the cabbage roses, which are slowly opening their furred petals to devour and drag her down into the carpet's design. With bird-quick eye cocked askew, she can see in the nick of time how perilous needles grain the floorboards and outwit their brambled plan. Now through her ambushed air, adazzle with bright shards of broken glass, she edges with wary breath, fending off jag and tooth, until, turning sideways, she lifts one webbed foot after the other into the still, sultry weather of the patient's dining room. Now, one of the most striking techniques that Plath uses in this poem is enjambement. This is where the lines run on, and there's really, if you're reading it out, there's hardly any room to draw breath. The poem's basically made up of 2 sentences, and these are stretched across the 2 stanzas. 2 stanzas of 13 lines, so it's 26 lines, but only with a single break. Now, this effect, of course, is to suggest a kind of frenzied breathlessness, and Miss Drake is staggering on without rest. This breathlessness suggests her anguish and her own feelings of disorientation and lack of control. The tension rises as her sense of terror builds. Now, Miss Drake walking between the cabbage roses seems like quite a soothing image. Gardens are places of beauty, even of safety. But the next line introduces something peculiar. The petals are furred, like an animal, hence their capacity to devour and drag her down. And the hallucinatory experience is then explained in the next line, into the carpet's design. Carpets are often woven with floral motif. But for Miss Drake, this carpet has come alive. The alliteration of the D sound, devour, drag, down, conveys a sense of assault or the possibility of violence. Miss Drake, we later learn, is the new woman in the ward on her way to the patient's dining room. Miss Drake is an inpatient with a terrifying fear of the patterned carpet that she has to traverse to get to the patient's dining room. Now, Plath uses a number of techniques here to postpone our understanding so that we feel as Miss Drake feels before we understand. We're not told that Miss Drake is ill, rather we live through an experience that Miss Drake has had. We perceive as she does, and the emotional correlatives are clear: terror, disorientation, helplessness. The influence here is very obviously Lowell and Sexton, not Hughes. It's a good poem, but I'd like to conclude by looking at one of Plath's last poems, one of the very last poems, that mediates despair in a highly wrought poetic piece, Sheep in Fog. The hills step off into whiteness, people or stars regard me sadly. I disappointment. The train leaves a line of breath, oh slow horse the colour of rust, hooves dolorous bells, all morning the morning has been blackening, a flower left out. My bones hold a stillness, the far fields melt my heart. They threaten to let me through to a heaven, starless and fatherless, a dark water. Now, when the manuscripts relating to this poem came up for auction, Ted Hughes wrote an account of the evolution of the poem for Roy Davids of Sotheby's. And it's an account that purports to shed light on its meaning. He sets out to decode the poem, and he sought also to justify the final lines, or justify his view, rather, of the final lines. And I quote, "They don't quite work, don't ring true somehow." Well, I think this is a wonderful poem that explores feelings of loneliness and despair that are part of the human condition, and not unique to a poet already contemplating suicide. She died a couple of weeks after this poem was written. Now, there's an extraordinary economy about Plath's poem, and nowhere is it more obvious than in this poem. The title doesn't have any articles, indefinite or definite. It's not about a sheep in the fog, it's just sheep in fog. And this gives it a kind of universal reach. It's not about a one-off experience. And in terms of the poem's semantic fields, that's groups of words that we would understand as sort of belonging together. We have a rural set, suggesting a rural setting, sheep, hills, horse, hooves. We have another associated with living beings, breath, bones, heart. So we have a living being in a large rural landscape, which suggests vulnerability. There's also an astronomical lexis. We have stars, heaven, and the starless, which suggests not just a wide landscape, but also a wide nightscape. So we're in a very big space where the poetic voice is surely vulnerable. And this is made explicit in line 13, where we see the word threatened. The prepositions, we've got in, into, out, and through, suggest movement through space. And the final through to heaven suggests a move not simply through space, but from one world to another, from the mundane world to another otherworldly place, heaven. And the adverbs, sadly and slowly, are downbeat and suggest inevitability. The alliterative leaves a line, encourages a kind of visual extension which mirrors the aural extension, leaves a line. And the alliteration and repetition, all morning the morning, suggests circularity, as though we're somewhere where it's impossible to find escape. Then there's the homophone of morning, morning. So morning, M-O-R, and morning, M-O-U-R, which I think we also hear because of its proximity to the dolorous bells tolling, no doubt for the dead. And there is blackening, suggestive of the funereal. In the alliterative far fields melt my heart, the repeated F sound brings the words into close relationship, suggesting the scale of the landscape once more, mirroring the scale of the skyscape. And similarly, the repeated suffixes in starless and fatherless suggest an absence in the world, starless, and an absence in the speaker's life. And the starlessness picks up on the blackening and presages the dark water of the final line. It also echoes the portentous mood of the dolorous bells. In terms of colour, we have very little indeed. We have whiteness, the colour of rust, and blackening. It's a very limited palette for the description of a landscape. And this too adds to the atmosphere of bleakness, particularly as rust is, after all, a function of decay. It's when iron is being broken down that it rusts, and it's also a sort of reddish blood colour. There's also a good deal of personification, where Plath takes an inanimate object and has it behave as an animate one. So the hills step, stars regard me. I mean, this is an inversion. We regard the stars. We don't think of the stars regarding us. The train leaves a breath. The morning has been blackening, and the fields melt my heart. The speaker of the poem is relatively absent, lost like a sheep in the fog. People and stars regard me sadly. Here the speaker is the object of the verb. I disappoint them. Here the speaker is the subject, but the verb, of course, suggests a self-perception of failure. The speaker is then absent until line 11. My bones hold a stiffness. The far fields melt my heart. The rigidity of the speaker's body and the idea of stasis contrasts with the melting of the heart, perhaps conveying a sense of the overwhelming beauty of the landscape in all its bleakness. This is a poem that describes a liminal space, a moment on a threshold, everything on the brink. And this is supported by the form of the poem. We have 5 stanzas. The first is a single sentence. The second, third, and fourth are a single sentence, using Ensemble More. And the final 3 lines are also a single sentence. So you could say that the form is sort of 3 plus 9 plus 3. And then if we think about the logic of that, we look for a relationship between the first stanza and the final stanza. And I think that link is the idea of the liminal, the threshold. Hills stepping into whiteness is a very vivid evocation of something we've seen when low cloud and fog causes a hill to vanish. Here it's being inverted, but we know that clouds and fog scudding can trick our eyesight. Here the hills step into the whiteness. Now this is in part a metaphor for the speaker in the final stanza, on the brink of being, and I quote, let through to a heaven. We surely associate heaven with whiteness, so the hills step off into whiteness, and they threaten to let me through to a heaven. Just as the hills have faded from sight, so the speaker may become invisible. And the 3 stanzas that are in between these 2 ideas, the mirroring of what's going on in the landscape and what might go on in the poet or the speaker's life, are delayed by these 3 stanzas that intervene. And the vowel sound o, oo, and ow, which is explicit in line 5, oh, slow, this slows the pace of the poem down. We've got horse, colour, whose, dolorous, morning, out, bones, hold, all those o and oo sounds. And the final stanza, by contrast, is fantastically compressed, and you have these imploding rhymes of threaten heaven, starless, fatherless. I encourage you to read Hughes's reading of Sheep in Fog. You'll find it online, that he wrote for Sotheby's, and see whether you agree that his is a very reducing process. In my view, I don't think Hughes necessarily did this consciously, but his reading attempts to kind of monopolize or appropriate the meaning of the poem in ways that reduce its extraordinarily suggestiveness. It's so mesmerizing and mysterious. It's as though he's installed some sort of monstrous machine that has blown the fog away and left the hills there themselves and no longer capable of generating this kind of poetry. He decodes what's an elusive, fantastically complex set of ideas and feelings conveyed in a highly wrought poetic technique to provide a rather straightforward reading. It's a plausible one, but Hughes does not hold a monopoly on interpretation, however close they were as poets and lovers. Here I'd like to end by citing Keats's notion of negative capability, which I touched on earlier in the year. It's both a kind of poetic and philosophical notion, and Plath, unlike Hughes, had studied a good deal of philosophy. Philosophy is very much part of the liberal arts college curriculum in the States. Now, Keats defines the idea thus, and I quote, "When a man is capable of being in uncertainties, mysteries, doubts, without any irritable reaching after fact and reason." Plath, in my view, despite her mental illness, strived to live exactly in this way, and I think that Sheep in Fog demonstrates this. What Hughes saw as lacking, his criticism of the final 3 lines, I see as Plath's capacity to accept irresolution. Plath was also a keen reader of T.S. Eliot, whom I mentioned earlier, and in his famous essay, Tradition and the Individual Talent, he wrote, "The progress of the artist is a continual self-sacrifice, a continual extinction of personality." And I'm reminded of Mrs. Ramsay in Virginia Woolf's To the Lighthouse, who looks at things so intently, and I quote, "until she became the things she looked at." Plath and Woolf both committed suicide and have become mythical figures. Why, I don't think we'll ever know. But what matters to me is to recognize and celebrate their greatness as writers and their ability to make out of difficult human experience and feelings works of supreme literary power. Thank you.